Her portraits captured a person's spirit because she mixed it straight into the paint. In 1882, Nevada, Sarah Murdock, the wife of a local undertaker, did something that would forever change her life and death. She painted portraits, but not with traditional paints. No, Sarah mixed the blood of the dead into her brushes, capturing more than just their likeness. It captured their spirits. Was she preserving their souls or trapping them forever? Some say she sought immortality for the love of her husband. Others believe she was unlocking a deadly secret. But the price of immortality was far steeper than Sarah could ever imagine, and it was about to claim her. Sarah Murdock had always dreamed of a life filled with love and light. When she met Thomas, the local undertaker, she thought she had found just that. Thomas wasn't like the other men in town. He was calm, steady, and dependable, everything Sarah had ever wanted. Their wedding was small but beautiful, and she believed it was the beginning of a perfect life. But Thomas' work, which she had thought of as just a job, soon became something far darker. In the early days of their marriage, Sarah barely thought about the nature of Thomas' work. She was a young woman, eager to build a life with the man she adored. She moved into the small house they'd built on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the whispering winds of Nevada. But the more Sarah settled in, the more she became aware of the macabre details of her husband's profession. Thomas would spend hours in the back room of their home cleaning and embalming, preparing bodies for burial. At first, Sarah thought nothing of it. It was just part of life. But then, late one night, she happened upon him in the middle of a task that made her stomach turn. He was brushing the lifeless face of a recently deceased man, his pale hands gentle but methodical. The room smelled of antiseptic, of something both clinical and organic. Sarah had never seen death up close before. "Thomas," she whispered, stepping into the doorway. "What are you doing?" Thomas looked up, his face softening with the weight of his work. "I'm making them presentable," he said quietly. "It's not just about the body, it's about respect, about giving them dignity in death." Something about the way he spoke, as though this was a normal part of life, unsettled Sarah. She wasn't repelled by him though, she loved him deeply, but she began to understand that Thomas was no longer the man she had married. He was consumed by death, almost as if it had become part of his very soul. She couldn't bring herself to look away from the body on the table. She found herself staring at the lifeless eyes, wondering where the spirit of the man had gone and why Thomas seemed so at ease with the emptiness that remained. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's unease grew. The room, once filled with warmth and laughter, began to feel cold-haunted even. The silence between Sarah and Thomas became more pronounced. She would watch him at his work, standing in the shadows, and wonder what was truly happening in that small room. There was a sense of finality in everything he did. He was preparing the dead, making them presentable. But in that moment, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, what was it all for? One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the house, her thoughts spiraling, she overheard Thomas speaking to someone in hushed tones. She crept toward the back room, but froze when she heard him mention something that chilled her to the bone. "You can't just bury them. They need to be remembered. They need to live on. It's the only way." She couldn't make sense of his words, but they struck her deeply. What did Thomas mean? Why did he speak of the dead as if they weren't truly gone? The thought gnawed at her for days, but she kept her questions to herself. She couldn't bear the thought of confronting him, especially when he was so deep in his work. Then, something strange happened. Sarah's curiosity began to take over. She found herself drawn to the paintings that adorned their walls, each one depicting faces of people she didn't know, people she couldn't even remember. At first, she thought nothing of them, but something about the portraits felt wrong, as if they weren't simply capturing likenesses, were capturing something deeper, something otherworldly. It wasn't long before Sarah began to experiment. She had always been an artist, and one night, as she watched Thomas at his work, an idea came to her. What if she could capture the essence of the dead, not just their likeness, but their spirit? She could use her art to honor the souls of the departed. She had heard stories of artists using strange methods to paint, and in her desperation to understand Thomas' obsession with the dead, she decided to try something different. That night, she sneaked into Thomas' study, where he kept his embalming tools. She carefully took a vial of blood, the blood of one of the bodies he had recently prepared. She hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling, but something inside her urged her to keep going. She mixed the blood with her paints and began to work. The brush felt strange in her hand, heavy with something she couldn't quite name, but as she painted, she felt an odd sense of connection. It was as if the spirit of the person was right there with her, standing in the room, guiding her hand. By the time the painting was finished, Sarah felt something change in the air. The room grew colder, and the weight of the silence became unbearable. She turned to look at the portrait, and her breath caught in her throat. The eyes of the man she had painted seemed to follow her, moving ever so slightly with each step. Her heart raced. What had she done? Her curiosity was no longer about art, it was about something far darker. She had mixed blood with paint, but what had she truly captured? The image in front of her wasn't just a face, it felt alive. The spirit of the man seemed to linger, trapped within the canvas. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to haunt Sarah forever. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had shifted. She had crossed a line. As the days passed, Sarah became more obsessed. The lines between the living and the dead began to blur, and she couldn't tell if the paintings were growing stronger, if she was losing her grip on reality. The whispers began. For Sarah, the bigger problem wasn't the isolation she felt. It wasn't even her growing obsession with the paintings. The true problem was that, with each brushstroke, she was no longer just painting faces. She was trapping souls. And what she didn't know was that she had already begun to paint her own doom. But this was just the beginning. Sarah's art was no longer just a way to honor the dead. It was becoming something far more dangerous, and the spirits she had captured were growing restless. Sarah had never thought much about death before she married Thomas, but now, every corner of their life seemed to be haunted by it. She could feel it in the air, in the cold of the back room where Thomas prepared the dead. It wasn't just the smell of chemicals and embalming fluid that filled the house, it was the weight of something darker, something that had taken hold of her husband's soul and soon enough seemed to be creeping into her own. Her obsession with the dead had started quietly, with the portraits hanging on the walls. At first, they were just faces strangers frozen in time, their expressions trapped in oil paints. But as Sarah worked on her own painting, mixing blood with her paint for the first time, she felt something shift. The spirits of the departed were no longer abstract concepts. They were real, and they were calling out to her. The whispers started softly. At night, as she worked, she thought she heard murmurs coming from the paintings, low voices barely audible, like the voices of those who had long since passed. It was maddening, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel that these whispers were a gift and invitation to connect with the world of the dead. They were asking for her help, and Sarah, eager to understand this strange power, couldn't ignore them. The next morning, Sarah decided she would paint again, but this time it would be different. She wasn't just going to capture someone's likeness, she was going to capture their spirit. She was going to honor the dead in a way no one had ever done before. Her chance came sooner than she expected. One evening, as Sarah walked into the local market, she ran into Mrs. Delaney, the widow of a local man who had passed away recently. Mrs. Delaney looked worn, her face tired from grief. Her eyes were red-rimmed from endless nights of mourning. When she saw Sarah, her face lit up with a brief flash of recognition. "Oh, Mrs. Murdock, I didn't see you there," she said, her voice faltering. Sarah smiled softly. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Delaney? You look tired." The widow sighed, pressing a hand to her chest. "I've been to see Thomas. The burial preparations are done, but it feels like something is missing. I don't know how to let him go. It's as if Hez still here with me somewhere in this world, but I need something to remember him by, something to keep him close." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She had heard people speak of the dead in strange ways, but never like this. Mrs. Delaney's words struck a chord in Sarah, and before she could stop herself, the words slipped from her lips. "Would you like me to paint him? I could capture his spirit for you." Mrs. Delaney's eyes widened, her grief-stricken face softening with a faint hope. "You'd do that? Oh, please, Mrs. Murdock. It would mean the world to me." The moment the offer left her mouth, Sarah knew she was no longer talking about simple portraiture. She wasn't just going to paint Mr. Delaney's facet, was going to try to capture something far more profound. She could feel the pull of the spirits inside her, urging her to move forward, to see if she could truly bring them back. The next morning, Sarah went to Thomas' study, her heart racing. She had planned it all. She would take some of the blood from the body Thomas had embalmed the night before, the very blood she had used in her own portrait. Her hands trembled as she carefully measured out the liquid, mixing it with her paints. For a moment, she hesitated. What was she doing? Was this madness? But the thought was fleeting. She couldn't stop herself now. The spirits were waiting. Returned to her studio, the room where she had painted her first portrait. She set up the canvas, her brush poised in midair. The blood mixed with the paint felt heavier, colder. As she began to work, she felt a strange magnetic pull toward the portrait. Each stroke seemed to draw her deeper into a world she couldn't see, but could sense. It was as if the spirit of Mr. Delaney was already with her, guiding her hand, telling her where to go. The air grew colder with each stroke, and the whispers grew louder. But then, something strange happened. As Sarah worked, she noticed something in the corner of her eye, a faint shadow hovering near the door. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but when she looked closer, she saw Ita shape, too solid to be a shadow, too formless to be real. The air seemed to vibrate, as if charged with static. "Who's there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but she felt Ita's presence, something powerful and ancient. It wasn't just Mr. Delaney. No, this was something else, something darker. The spirit she had called upon had been joined by others. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to focus on the painting. But it was no use. The whispers had become cries loud, desperate voices begging for release. Sarah's hand shook as she gripped the brush tighter. She had gone too far. This wasn't just art anymore, it was something else, something dangerous. Then, as if in answer to the spirit's cries, Sarah felt the room grow colder. A rush of wind swept through the studio, knocking over the easel. The canvas flew off the table, slamming against the wall. The painting was gone, and in its place was only darkness. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen. The room was silent. The air, once charged with the restless energy of the spirits, was now eerily still. She approached the fallen canvas, her heart racing. What had just happened? She turned it over and gasped. The portrait she had painted was gone. In its place was something much worse. The figure on the canvas was no longer just a man, it was a distorted, twisted version of Mr. Delaney, his face contorted in agony. His eyes were wide open, filled with terror, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. But it wasn't just the man's face. The painting was alive. His eyes seemed to follow her, and his mouth, oh God, his mouth moved. A word escaped from the painting, low and guttural. "Help." Sarah stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't art anymore. She had trapped something in that painting, something far worse than she had ever imagined, but she wasn't done. No, the whispering spirits were still with her. She had created a doorway to something darker, and it wasn't just her portrait she had trapped. The spirits were beginning to claim her, but Sarah's obsession had only just begun. What she didn't know was that by capturing the spirit of Mr. Delaney, she had opened a door to something far worse, and soon, the spirits she had invited into her. Life would begin to demand more from her, much more than she could ever give. The days that followed Sarah's first encounter with the spirit on the canvas were filled with a strange mix of fascination and dread. The painting, with its tortured depiction of Mr. Delaney, sat in her studio, its presence both haunting and mesmerizing. Every time Sarah walked past it, she felt a cold chill creep up her spine. It was as if the painting was alive, watching, waiting. The whispers started soon after. At first, they were faint, nothing more than a soft hum that seemed to come from the shadows of the room. Sarah tried to ignore them, chalking it up to her overactive imagination, but the whispers grew louder each day. They weren't just words, they were pleading, desperate, as if the spirits trapped in her paintings were calling to her for help. She couldn't help but listen. The more she listened, the more the whispers became distinct. She could hear individual voices, now voices that sounded familiar, but she couldn't place them. Some sounded like the people she had painted, others like strangers, their voices warped and muffled by the canvas. And every time she painted, the whispers intensified. One night, after another long session at her easel, Sarah sat back, exhausted and shaking. She had just finished painting a portrait of a local woman who had recently passed away in another attempt to honor the dead. But when she turned to clean her brushes, she heard Ida's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Sarah." She froze. The voice wasn't coming from her thoughts, it was coming from the painting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the canvas. The image of the woman she had just painted looked the same as before, serene, peaceful even. But the voice? It was unmistakably real. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, this time more forceful. "Help us, we are trapped." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The paintingist woman, who had seemed so lifeless, was now speaking to her. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with a pressure she couldn't explain. Her skin tingled as though the spirits in her paintings had come alive and were reaching out for something to pull them from their prison. For a moment, Sarah considered running. She thought about the lives she had painted, the blood she had mixed with the paint. What had she done? What had she opened? But the voice came again, louder this time. "It's too late. You've already invited us in. Now you must listen." Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, and she sank to the floor. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. The whispers stopped. Silence enveloped the room. But then, just as quickly, the spirit spoke again, her voice more distinct. "You don't understand. You're the key." Sarah's mind spun. The key? What did that mean? Her body trembled as she looked at the painting in front of her, feeling a pull she couldn't explain. She had thought she was simply honoring the dead, preserving their memory in her art. But now she saw the truth. Her paintings weren't just capturing likeness, they were trapping souls. The realization hit her like a wave, drowning her in fear. She hadn't just invited the spirits into her home, she had become their prison. She had opened a door, and now they were reaching through it, desperate to escape. "What did I do?" she whispered, her voice shaking with terror. "What do you want from me?" There was a long pause. Then the voice came again, softer, more haunting than before. "Your art is our prison. You must let us go. You must paint us free." The words seemed to hang in the air, their weight crushing Sarah's chest. How could she let them go? How could she free the spirits she had trapped in her paintings? She was terrified, but at the same time, she felt an undeniable pull. The whispers had become a part of her now, woven into the very fabric of her existence. They were in her mind, in her blood, in her hands, and she could no longer ignore them. That night, Sarah stayed up late, staring at her canvases. The voices in her head, the voices from the paintings, had become louder. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were demands. She could escape them. The pressure in the room was unbearable, as if the spirits were pressing against the walls, wanting out. But the more Sarah listened, the more she understood. The spirits weren't just trying to get out, they were trying to drag her in. The price she had paid for immortality was far higher than she had imagined. It wasn't just her art that had become a prison. She'd become a part of the prison itself. She was the key to their freedom, and if she didn't act, they would consume her. As Sarah's fear grew, so did her obsession. She had already begun the process. She had already painted their souls into her canvases, given them a place to linger, to exist. Now she was too deep to pull back. The line between life and death had blurred, and she didn't know how to separate herself from the spirits she had captured. In the days that followed, Sarah became consumed by her work. She painted tirelessly, trying to capture the souls of the departed and give them release. But every painting she completed only seemed to trap them further, binding them to the canvas in a way she couldn't understand. Each portrait she painted became more distorted, more twisted, as if the spirits were fighting back, trying to tear through the canvas. And with each new portrait, the voices grew stronger. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were screams, cries of anguish that rattled the walls of her home. She could feel them pressing in on her, demanding to be freed. The more she tried to help them, the more they clawed at her sanity, pushing her toward the edge of madness. Sarah had become a vessel for the spirits, her art their prison. But it wasn't just the spirits that were trapped. No, something darker was beginning to take hold of her. The whispers, the voices, had already begun to twist her mind, to reshape her thoughts. She was losing herself to the spirits she had tried so desperately to control. But this wasn't the worst of it. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in her studio, staring at the latest portrait she had completed, something caught her eye. The painting wasn't the peaceful image she had tried to create. No, it was something far worse. The figure on the canvas, woman she had tried to honor, now staring back at her with wild, frantic eyes. She was no longer the serene face Sarah had painted. She was alive, and she was angry. Sarah recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. The painting was alive, and it wasn't just a woman. It was all of them. The spirit she had painted had begun to escape the canvas, and they were reaching for her. But Sarah's terror was just beginning. The spirits had grown too powerful. She thought she could control them, but now they were taking control of her. The door she had opened could never be closed, and soon it would claim her completely. Sarah hadn't slept in days. The whispers, the demands of the spirit had become all-consuming. They didn't just haunt her at night anymore. They followed her every step, echoed in the back of her mind, and bled into her waking thoughts. The air around her was thick with an energy she couldn't control. The spirits were growing stronger, more desperate, and she knew, deep in her bones, that she was running out of time. The house, once her sanctuary, had become a prison. Every wall felt like it was closing in, suffocating her with their presence. She could feel their eyes on her, even when she wasn't looking at the paintings. The souls she had captured, those who had begged for release, were no longer just spirits in the canvas. They were something worse. They were memories, emotions, and desires twisted into something monstrous. It wasn't just the paintings that were alive anymore. The spirits were moving beyond the canvas. She had trapped them, but now they were beginning to claw their way out, and they wanted more. They wanted her. One night, as Sarah sat in her studio, her hands shaking from exhaustion, she stared at the portraits she had painted. The faces of the dead stared back at her lifeless, yet somehow full of emotion. Some were peaceful, some were anguished, but none were free. The whispers had become more insistent. They weren't just speaking to her anymore, they were demanding things. They needed her to finish what she had started, to release them. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, a noise that carried a weight Sarah wasn't ready to face. She stood, hesitating for a moment, before walking to the door. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face drawn, tired. His eyes, once full of life, now seemed hollow, as though a part of him had already faded into the background of his work. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "you've been in here for days. What's happening? You're not eating, you're not sleeping, you're not yourself anymore." Sarah felt a cold rush of panic flood her veins. She had kept him at arm's length for so long, hiding the truth from him, the truth about the paintings, the truth about what she had done. And now, he was standing there, looking at her with concern and perhaps something else. Fear. He was afraid of what she had become. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice hollow. I'm just working, Thomas. I'm making something beautiful, something that can help." "Help?" he repeated, his brow furrowing. "Sarah, these paintings, they're not helping. I don't know what you're doing, but it's not healthy." "You've crossed a line." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She didn't want to hear this. She couldn't. Not now. The spirits were calling to her, their voices growing louder, demanding that she finish what she had started. But she couldn't let Thomas see her weakness, not now. Not when she had already gone too far. "Please, Thomas," she whispered, stepping away from the door. "Just leave me alone for a while." But Thomas didn't leave. Instead, he stepped inside, crossing the threshold. He walked past her, his eyes scanning the studio. The room was cluttered with canvases, all filled with faces, all filled with spirits that no one should ever have to deal with. The paintings were everywhere now, on the walls, on the floor, scattered in every corner like the ghosts of Sarah's own soul. He stopped in front of one of the paintings, Delaney's portrait, the first one she had painted with blood. Thomas' face went pale. He turned to Sarah, his voice barely a whisper. "What have you done?" he asked, his eyes wide with fear. "What is this?" Sarah felt her heart drop. She hadn't wanted him to see. She hadn't wanted anyone to see. But there it was, Delaney's eyes following them, the twisted anguish on his face as if the spirit was screaming for help. "Tu didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice faltering. "Thomas, you don't understand. I was trying to bring them peace. I thought I could help them, but it's worse than I thought. They won't leave me alone." Thomas stepped back, his expression a mixture of disbelief and horror. "Sarah, you've opened a door, and now the spirits are inside you. They're using you. You need to stop. You need to let them go." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She couldn't. The whispers had grown too loud, too persistent. They were no longer just voices in the background, they were inside her, crawling under her skin. And she could feel them pushing, urging her to finish what she had started. "Help me," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Thomas, help me." Thomas looked at her, his face filled with pity and terror. "I don't know how," he said, his voice cracking. "But this isn't you. This is something else, something dark." Then, without warning, the whispers reached a crescendo. It was as though the walls of the house were closing in on them, the very air thick with the energy of the spirits, pressing down on them both. And then, in the deepest part of Sarah's mind, she heard it clear, commanding and powerful. "Release us, or we will take her." The voice was unmistakable. It was no longer a whisper, it was a declaration. And the threat was real. The spirits were no longer asking for her help, they were demanding her soul. Sarah's mind reeled. The spirits were powerful. They were far stronger than she had ever realized, and they were willing to do whatever it took to escape. If she didn't act soon, they would claim not just her, but Thomas too. They had already taken her art, her sanity, and now they wanted more. A sudden thought struck her. Maybe there was a way to stop this. Maybe she could make a deal, a bargain. She turned to Thomas, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please," she begged, "I need your help. I'll do anything. I just need to be free from this. I need to stop the spirits from taking everything." Thomas looked at her, his face torn with indecision, but Sarah could see the flicker of something in his eyes, willingness to do whatever it took to save her, to save both of them. And in that moment, Sarah knew. She had no choice but to make the most dangerous bargain of all. "I'll make them an offer," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to do. "But I can't do it alone. I need you." Thomas nodded, stepping closer. "What are you asking?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the canvas that had started it all, the one with Mr. Delaney's anguished face. She reached out trembling and began to speak. "Spirits of the dead, hear my plea. I offer you a trade. I will paint you free, but in exchange, you must leave me and my husband in peace. Release us, let us go." The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with anticipation, but nothing happened. The whispers stopped, the spirits waited. But what Sarah didn't know was that bargains with the dead rarely come without a price, and in the end, she would learn that even a soul can be bought if one is willing to pay the ultimate price. The days following Sarah's desperate bargain felt like a strange dream, one she couldn't wake up from. The spirits, once so loud and insistent, had quieted. The atmosphere in the house had shifted, but the silence was suffocating. She could feel it pressing in on her, weighing down on her every movement. She had made a deal with the dead, but what had she truly traded? What had she promised them in exchange for freedom? She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, something was missing. The painting of Mr. Delaney, once filled with tortured, pleading eyes, now hung quietly on the wall, his expression as serene as any portrait of a peaceful soul. The whispers had stopped, but Sarah knew the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the calm before a storm. Thomas, who had been reluctant to get involved with Sarah's obsession, had left her alone after that night. He had gone to work, buried in the routines of his Undertaker. Business, but Sarah couldn't escape the nagging fear that the bargain she had struck had not been enough. She wasn't free, not yet, not until the spirits were truly gone. As days passed, Sarah's desperation turned into obsession once more. She spent hours in her studio, trying to paint her way out of the situation. She had promised the spirits their release, but she had not fulfilled her end of the bargain. She had not painted them free. Instead, she had captured them, trapped them in the very portraits they had begged to escape. The more she painted, the more she realized she had only bound them tighter. But then, one afternoon, a feeling unlike any she had known before surged through her. The air around her grew thick with an unnatural chill, and the paintings, each one of them, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She stepped back, staring at the canvases that had once been her greatest achievement. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't the kind of art she had once envisioned. This was something darker. She took a step closer to Mr. Delaney's portrait. The man's face, once tranquil and calm, now seemed to twist in agony. His eyes, those dead, lifeless eyes, were wide open again, staring straight through her as if he could see into her soul. The room seemed to close in around her as she reached for the portrait. Her fingers grazed the canvas, and an electric shock of cold shot up her arm. She pulled back, horrified. The eyes Delaney's eyes followed her as she stepped away. The whispers came again, but this time they were different. The voices no longer begged for release. They demanded it. Suddenly, Sarah felt the pull of something far stronger than her fear. A presence of force began to materialize behind her. It was cold, like ice in her veins, but it wasn't the spirits calling to her. It was something else, something much darker. She turned around, her heart pounding in her chest, only to find Thomas standing in the doorway of the studio. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling, "what have you done? This isn't you. These paintings are wrong." Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, and she felt the weight of the bargain she had made pressing down on her. It was as if the paintings had become windows into another world, a world where the spirits no longer needed to whisper. They could speak, scream, demand. They were no longer trapped in the canvas. The barrier between life and death had shattered. I didn't mean to," Sarah started, but her voice faltered. She didn't know how to explain it. How could she? She had promised them peace, but instead, she had given them power. She had captured their souls. Yes, but she had also made them stronger. Thomas stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the paintings. "You've unleashed something, Sarah. Something that's not just in the paintings, it's in us. It's in you." She could feel it too. The pull, the darkness. It was inside her now, crawling under her skin, winding through her veins, like poison. She had opened the door, and now it was closing in around her. The air in the room thickened. The walls seemed to press in. The whispers were growing louder than ever before. They were no longer just voices. They were shapes, forms, shadows flickering in the corners of the room. And then, one by one, the spirits in the portraits began to shift. Their faces twisted, contorted into grotesque, unnatural expressions of rage. Suddenly, Sarah felt the full weight of the bargain she had made. She had promised them freedom, but in doing so, she had unknowingly bound herself to them. They weren't just trapped in her paintings anymore, they were inside her. They were feeding on her. and she was feeding them. Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the paintings. "Sarah, we need to get out of here. We need to leave. This Place's house, it's no longer safe." But Sarah could barely hear him. The voices were too loud now, too powerful. She could feel them in her mind, clawing at her thoughts. They were taking over. "Sarah," Thomas said again, his voice desperate. "You need to fight them. You need to fight whatever this is." But Sarah was beyond fighting. She had already given them what they wanted. She had already crossed the line. The price of immortality wasn't just her soul, it was her very existence. She had made herself a vessel for the dead, and now they were taking her. In a final act of desperation, Sarah stumbled backward toward the window. She needed to escape. She needed to destroy the paintings, destroy everything before it consumed her completely. But as she reached for the canvas, her fingers brushed against something far colder than the canvas itself. She turned around, and what she saw stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't Thomas standing in the doorway anymore. It was Mr. Delaney. The figure from the painting had come to life, his eyes burning with a furious, unholy light. He stepped forward, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The other spirits followed, emerging from the paintings, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions of agony. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away, but it was too late. They were no longer trapped, and neither was she. But the spirits weren't finished with Sarah. They hadn't just come for her, they had come for something much worse, and Sarah was about to learn that the cost of immortality was far greater than she could have ever imagined. The house was silent again, too silent. Sarah could feel it in her bones. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but the presence in the room was undeniable. The spirits, once so desperate for release, had not only escaped their canvas prisons, they had become part of her world, part of her. She stared at the paintings, her once proud creations now warped, twisting with energy she could no longer control. Mr. Delaney's portrait, once calm and serene, had transformed into a nightmare. His mouth now stretched open in an agonizing scream, his eyes wild with terror. But it wasn't. Just his face that had changed his whole figure seemed to pulse with unnatural life, as if he were trying to break free of the confines of the painting itself. Sarah's breath quickened. She had tried to release them. She had tried to fulfill the bargain she had made. But now she realized she had only deepened her own prison. The spirits had become more powerful, and they weren't done yet. In the corner of the room, Thomas stood frozen, watching the madness unfold. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. He had tried to pull Sarah away, to get her to see reason, but there was no reasoning with the spirits now. They were beyond control. "I can't do this anymore," Thomas muttered, his voice barely audible. He shook his head, backing away from the growing presence in the room. "You've unleashed something we can't stop." Sarah's heart ached at the sound of his voice, the pain in his words cutting through her like a blade. She had never wanted this. She had never meant for any of this to happen. She had only wanted to capture something beautiful, something eternal. But in her desperation, she had brought darkness into their home. She looked at him, her voice trembling. "Thomas, you didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was helping them. But now, I can't stop it. I can't stop them." Thomas didn't respond. He simply turned away, walking toward the door, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Sarah's heart broke as she watched him leave, as if he were abandoning her, in the face of the horror she had created. But she couldn't blame him. How could he stay? How could anyone stay in a house that had become a gateway to the dead? The door creaked open, and Sarah thought she heard him call out to her, but the words were drowned out by the sound of a cold wind sweeping through the room. Her eyes darted to the window, where the glass began to tremble, rattling in its frame. The temperature in the room dropped far colder than any winter night she had ever experienced. And then, a voice. Sarah. The voice was not Thomas. It wasn't any of the spirits she had trapped. This voice was different. It was familiar, yet completely wrong. It sent a chill down her spine, freezing her in place. She turned toward the source of the voice, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway, bathed in an unnatural light, was a figure she had never expected to see. But somehow, in her heart, she had known that this moment was coming. It was Thomas, but it wasn't Thomas, not anymore. His face was pale, his skin almost translucent, and his eyes were no longer filled with warmth or life. They were dark hollow, like empty pits. His mouth opened, but instead of speaking, a low guttural growl escaped his lips. He took a step toward her, and his body seemed to flicker, like a shadow trying to become something more. "Thomas?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, her throat tight with fear. She wanted to believe it was him. She had to believe it was him. But she could see it now. The spirit, the thing standing before her was not Thomas. It was a twisted imitation of him, a dark reflection of the man she had once loved. "Thomas, what happened to you?" she cried, stepping back, but the figure continued to move toward her, its movements jerky, unnatural. The air around him crackled with cold energy, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward him, as if drawn by his presence. A low laugh rumbled from his throat, deep and disturbing. "You think you can escape me, Sarah?" The voice was Thomas, but it was wrong, twisted. "You thought you could cheat death. But death isn't something you can escape. It's a part of you now." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she took another step back, her feet unsteady. The figure that once resembled her husband reached out for her, his fingers long and skeletal, his touch cold as ice. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the horrifying truth. The bargain she had made hadn't just trapped the spirits, it had bound them to her. And now, it had taken Thomas too. The deal she thought she had struck was not a way to free them, it had been a way to drag them all into the same hell. And Thomas was the first to fall victim to it. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "This can't be happening. This isn't real." But the figure didn't stop. It stepped closer, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. Sarah could feel the cold creeping into her skin, crawling through her veins like poison, and as it reached out to touch her, she felt herself drawn toward it, as if her body was no longer her own. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It recoiled, as if something invisible had struck it. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The painting of Mr. Delaney, the one she had tried to free, had changed again. His mouth was open, but this time it was not a scream, it was a command. His eyes were locked on her, and Sarah realized with horror that he was no longer trapped in the canvas. He was free, and he was watching her, waiting for her to do something. The spirits were no longer just haunting the room, they were controlling it. They had become more than just images on canvas. They had taken shape. They had become real, and they weren't finished with her. The figure of Thomas let out a shrill scream, as if in agony, before disintegrating into a cloud of smoke. The air became thick with the stench of decay, and Sarah fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The spirits had left their mark. They had taken everything, and now there was nothing left to fight for. But Sarah still didn't understand the full price of immortality. She had unleashed the spirits, and in doing so, she had brought something even darker into her world. Something far worse than she could ever have imagined. Sarah could no longer tell where the spirit world ended and the real world began. The barrier between the two had shattered, and now the dead roamed freely in her home. The once peaceful portraits had become portals, each one a doorway to another reality, a reality where the dead held power and where she was their unwilling servant. The painting of Mr. Delaney, which had first revealed itself to her as a twisted, silent scream, was no longer just a haunting presence. It had become a command center. The spirit's toes she had painted, those she had once believed to be trapped, had begun to influence everything around her. They weren't just haunting her thoughts anymore. They were controlling her actions. Her every movement felt like it was being directed by a force she could neither see nor escape. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. They were in her ears, in her head, clawing at her sanity. She could feel them pulling at her, driving her further into madness. But the worst part, she could no longer tell if it was the spirits speaking or if it was her own voice, twisted and corrupted by the darkness she had let into her life. One night, after days of painting frantically, Sarah stood before her canvases. Each one was alive with energy, with souls trapped within the paint, writhing in agony. The air was thick with their presence. The spirits had taken her body as their vessel, and she had given herself to them, willingly desperate to finish what she had started, desperate to stop the torment. But now, it was clear, there would be no stopping it. The spirits had taken more than just her art. They had taken her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She hesitated for a moment, then turned toward the sound. Who could it be? Thomas had left. Her once safe home had become a haunted shell of what it used to be. There was no one left to turn to, no one who could help her. She walked toward the door, trembling. Her hands shook as she grasped the doorknob. The moment she opened it, she was met by the figure standing in the doorway, her husband, Thomas. But he didn't look the same. He looked wrong. His eyes were hollow, devoid of life. His face, once full of warmth and love, was now cold, lifeless. His body seemed to flicker like a flame, wavering between existence and nothingness. "Thomas?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "What's happened to you?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached for her, and as his hand brushed against her skin, a chill ran through her body. It was as if his touch had drained the warmth from her soul, leaving only an icy void. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice a hollow echo. "You've opened the door. Now, there's no going back." A wave of terror washed over her. She tried to pull away, but Thomas grabbed her arm, holding her firmly in place. His grip tightened, and for a moment, Sarah felt as though she were suffocating. The air around her grew thick with darkness. She could feel the spirits closing in, their cold fingers wrapping around her, pulling her into their grasp. "Please, let go of me," Sarah begged, her voice frantic. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't know." Thomas' face twisted into a grimace, the empty void in his eyes filling with something darker. "You knew," he said softly, his voice no longer his own. "You knew what you were doing. You thought you could control it. You thought you could trap us forever. But you've only made us stronger." His words hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She had known, hadn't she? She had known that once she began, there would be no turning back. She had invited the spirits into her life, and now they had taken everything. They had taken Thomas. They had taken her. As the darkness around her deepened, Sarah's thoughts began to unravel. She had opened the door to the afterlife, but she had never understood what that truly meant. The spirits weren't just trapped souls, they were powerful, malevolent forces that fed on her weakness. And she had given them what they wanted. The room spun as the air grew colder. Thomas' grip tightened it, and the space around them seemed to warp. The walls closed in. The paintings on the walls shook violently, their figures contorting, their faces warping into grotesque, twisted forms. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I didn't know." Thomas' grip loosened, and for a moment she thought he might let her go. But instead he leaned in close, his lips brushing against her ear. "It's too late now," he said, his voice a rasp. "You can't undo what you've done. You're ours now." With those words, the ground beneath her feet seemed to crumble. The room dissolved into darkness. The last thing Sarah saw before everything went black was the tortured face of Mr. Delaney, his eyes wide with fury, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. What Sarah didn't realize was that the spirits were just getting started. They hadn't claimed her yet, not fully, and in the end, they would demand something even darker than her soul. Sarah awoke to silence, a deafening silence that clung to her skin like cold sweat. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, but the darkness in her mind had lasted for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something she couldn't quite name. The presence of the spirits was gone, but she could feel their influence everywhere, lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts. She tried to move, but her body refused to obey. The numbness that had settled in her limbs was like a shackle, keeping her tethered to the ground. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of life, but it was the same, empty, cold, and still. The paintings were gone, or at least they should have been. But the feeling remained. The paintings had been more than just artwork. They were windows, and the spirits had taken root inside them. Her mind raced as she remembered the last moments before the darkness took her, the twisted figure of Thomas, his hollow eyes, the cold grip he had placed on her. But he hadn't been Thomas. No, that was a lie. That was the spirit, the one that had claimed him. The spirits she had captured in her portraits were no longer trapped. They were free, and they were using her to fuel their power, drawing from her as if she were nothing but a vessel. She had paid the price. She had agreed to it. In her desperation to immortalize her love, she had bound herself to the very forces she feared the most, and now they were closer than ever. With a sudden burst of strength, Sarah pushed herself upright. Her body ached, but she didn't care. She had to get out. She had to end this. If she didn't, the spirits would take her completely. She had already given them so much, but they weren't done. She could feel them reaching for her. Their whispers, faint at first, grew louder as she stumbled toward the door. The room was dim, the only light coming from the cracks in the wooden shutters. As she stepped into the hall, her gaze landed on the one thing she had tried to avoid, the portraits, still hanging on the walls. Each one of them seemed to watch her, their eyes following her every movement. The energy in the house was almost unbearable, now thick with the souls she had trapped, now free to roam as they pleased. It wasn't the portraits she feared, now it was what they represented, the power they held, and the control they had over her. She hurried past the paintings, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. It felt wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The spirits had taken everything from her art, her soul, and now her sanity. She couldn't live like this. The door at the end of the hall beckoned her, But as she reached for the knob, she felt a presence behind her. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't the spirits. It was something worse. A shadow passed by the door, so quick that she could only catch a glimpse of it before it disappeared. But that was enough. She knew what it meant. She had seen that shadow before. It was Mr. Delaney, the one spirit who had haunted her from the beginning, the one she had never fully understood, and now he was coming for her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the source of the movement. The room seemed to warp, the shadows shifting around her, as though the very walls were closing in. The temperature dropped so suddenly that she could see her breath in front of her. She backed away, feeling the cold wrap around her like a vice. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving toward her with purpose. It was Mr. Delaney, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. The tortured look on his face was gone. In its place was something far worse, something sinister. His features were no longer twisted with anguish. They were cold, calculating. His smile was cruel. "You can't escape, Sarah," he said, his voice low and guttural, almost like a growl. "You've already made your choice. You can't run from this." "No," Sarah whispered, backing away. "I made a mistake. I thought I could fix it, but I can't. I need to." "Stop." But Delaney didn't listen. He reached out, his hand stretching toward her like a claw. Sarah stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The spirits were pulling her in. She had become their prisoner, their vessel. And then, everything went dark. The next thing she knew, she was standing in front of the painting she had first created, the one where she had mixed blood with her paints, trapping the soul of the first deceased person she had painted. But it wasn't just a painting anymore. It had become something else, a portal, a rift in the fabric of reality. The shadows swirled around her as the figures of the spirits gathered. She could feel them pressing against her, feeding on her energy. She could hear them, whispering in her ear, their voices blending into a single unified roar. "You can't escape us, Sarah," they said in unison. "We are a part of you now." Sarah felt her knees buckle beneath her. The spirits were taking her. They had become too powerful. They had taken everything from her, and now they would take her soul. But even in the face of this darkness, something inside Sarah resisted. She had made a deal. She had invited them into her life, into her art. But she had never truly understood the price of immortality. And now, she was about to pay it. Sarah had thought she could control the spirits, but in the end, she had only made herself a prisoner. The spirits had claimed her body, and soon they would claim her soul. The spirits had claimed her body and soul. Sarah could feel them inside her, whispering, gnawing, controlling. They had taken everything she had to give, and now demanded more. The portraits on the walls were no longer just images of the dead. They were prisons. And Sarah had built them. She had opened the door to the afterlife, and now the spirits were flooding through, pulling her deeper into their world. The barrier between life and death had blurred, and there was no going back. But even as the darkness closed in, Sarah's mind remained tethered to one desperate thought. She still had one last chance. The spirits were relentless. She could feel their icy grip tightening around her chest, suffocating her. Their whispers had become commands, their cries a constant, maddening soundtrack to her existence. They wanted her to finish what she had started, to release them from the portraits. But Sarah had come to realize the terrible truth. The spirits weren't just trapped in her art. They were using her as a vessel, feeding off her energy until there was nothing left. The thought of them devouring her completely sent a wave of panic through her. There had to be another way. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let her soul be consumed by their endless hunger. Sarah staggered across the room, her legs weak, her breath shallow. The air was thick with the weight of their presence, and as she reached the center of the room, she saw its self-portrait. It was the last portrait she had painted, the one that had started it all. The one she had painted in desperation, trying to capture the essence of herself before she lost everything. It was the painting of the woman she had once been, innocent, full of love, and know nothing more than a shell of herself. But the portrait had changed. It had warped over time, much like everything else. Her face was no longer serene. It was contorted with agony, her eyes wide with terror. But what chilled her the most was the faint, almost imperceptible smile that curled at the corners of her lips, the smile of someone who had made a terrible bargain. And in that moment, Sarah realized what she had to do. She had been fighting the wrong battle. She wasn't going to stop the spirits by resisting. She had to join them. She had to accept the bargain they had offered her, and in doing so, find a way to free herself from their clutches. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the brush. She mixed the paint with the blood she had used to trap the spirits, feeling the energy crackle in her veins as the dark liquid swirled together. She had always believed that painting was her way of preserving life, but now she understood. Painting was the key to immortality, and it wasn't her immortality she was after. Her brush hovered over the canvas, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the weight of the spirits lifting. They were no longer pulling at her, demanding release. They were watching, waiting. She dipped the brush into the blood-mixed paint and began to work. The strokes were steady, deliberate. She painted herself a woman she once was, before everything had gone wrong. But as she painted, something strange happened. The woman on the canvas began to move. Her eyes blinked, and her fingers twitched as if coming to life. It was working. Sarah didn't stop. She had to finish. She had to finish before the spirits realized what she was doing. The smile on her painted face grew wider, and as she continued, the woman in the portrait began to step forward, out of the canvas, as if breaking free from the chains that had bound her. Her limbs came to life, and she reached out, her hands now solid, tangible. Then, the spirit of Sarah's former self version of her that had been pure, untainted by the curse, stepped into the room. But Sarah wasn't prepared for what happened next. As soon as the portrait version of herself crossed the threshold of the canvas, the entire room shook. The walls groaned, and the paintings on the walls cracked, their frames splintering into jagged pieces. The spirits, who had been watching Sarah with growing interest, began to screech, their wails filling the room with unbearable sound. The air grew thick with pressure, and the room seemed to warp, twisting around Sarah. The spirit of Sarah's former self stopped in the center of the room, her eyes filled with knowing sadness. She looked directly at Sarah, the woman who had painted her into existence. "You've freed me, but at what cost?" the portrait version of Sarah asked, her voice soft, but filled with sorrow. "You can't trap yourself here. You cannot live forever in the world of the dead." But Sarah didn't want to hear it. She didn't care. She had made the bargain. She had chosen to save herself, even if it meant paying the price for eternity. She was already lost to the spirits. The spirits had taken her, and now they would take everything. Except one thing. The portrait version of Sarah stepped forward, offering her a hand. "If you stay, you become one of them. But if you choose to leave, you may live, for a time, long enough to undo the damage." Sarah stood frozen, her mind reeling. The offer was too tempting. She could leave the spirits behind, live again, even if only for a short while. But the price was steep. What would she have to sacrifice to regain her freedom? Before she could answer, a new voice erupted from the paintings. "No, she cannot leave. We will not let her go," the spirits screamed in unison, their voices now combined into one terrifying roar. But Sarah, feeling the last vestiges of her humanity slipping away, made her choice. She stepped forward, reaching for the outstretched hand of her painted self, and as her fingers touched the hand, the room erupted into an explosion of light, blinding and scorching. The spirits shrieked, their forms dissipating, vanishing as the light grew stronger. But as Sarah stepped into the light, she didn't realize that she'd made a final bargain. The cost of immortality had taken more than she ever anticipated. She had chosen freedom, but at what price? And what had she really freed herself from? Sarah's body was no longer hers. Her soul was no longer hers. The moment she had stepped into the light, she had left behind the woman she had once been. She had bargained for freedom, but what she had found was far worse than the prison she had left. The world around her had shifted, warped. The house that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a tombsland, suffocating and oppressive. She could feel the spirits, still lingering, their presence now stronger than ever. They were a part of her, and she of them, but they weren't the only things that had changed. She stood before the full-length mirror in her studio, staring at the reflection of herself. The woman who gazed back at her wasn't the woman she remembered. Her face was no longer hers, it was a twisted version, her eyes hollow and cold, her skin pale as marble. Her lips, once full and alive, were drawn into a thin, lifeless line. She looked dead, but she was still breathing. Her mind raced with the realization she had left the spirits behind, or so she thought, but in truth, she had become one of them. She had been pulled into the world she had once only painted, and now she was a part of it, trapped, forever. She could hear the whispers now, not the desperate pleas of the trapped souls from before, but something far worse. The spirits had claimed her, yes, but they hadn't just trapped her. They had made her their leader, their vessel, the one who would guide them into the world of the living. She had traded her soul for freedom, but the price had been her very identity. As Sarah walked through the house, the painting seemed to watch her. She could feel their eyes on her, following her every move. The spirits were with her, inside her, their power running through her veins. They were no longer trapped in the confines of their canvases. They were free to take whatever they wanted, free to take the living. But they needed her. They needed her to open the way, to lead them into the world that had once been hers. And so, she was trapped in a new waybound to the very spirits she had sought to control. The doorbell rang. The sound, though faint, pierced the suffocating silence of the house. Sarah froze. She hadn't expected anyone. She hadn't wanted anyone. But there they were. A group of people stood on the porch, their faces unfamiliar, but their expressions hopeful. They had come for her work. They had come to see the portraits, the famous cursed portraits that had drawn so many to her door. They had come to admire the art, to buy a piece of the supernatural, to possess the power she had once held in her hands. Sarah's heart raced. She knew what they wanted. She knew what would happen if she let them in, but she couldn't stop it. She was no longer in control. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the door. The group of strangers stood before her, their eyes wide with anticipation. The air outside seemed to buzz with energy, as if the spirits within her were stirring, excited by the prospect of new souls to claim. "Ms. Murdock," one of them said, his voice laced with excitement. "We've heard so much about your work," the portraitier said, to capture more than just the likeness of the deceased. "We've come to see them for ourselves." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. The spirits were rising within her, their hunger growing. She could feel them pressing against her skin, clawing to get out. The group stepped forward, eager to enter. But as they crossed the threshold, a strange, unnerving silence fell over the room. The air shifted, and Sarah could feel the temperature drop. She didn't have to look at the portraits to know what was happening. She could hear their whispers. The spirits were awake. The strangers looked at each other uneasy. "What's happening?" one of them asked, her voice trembling. Before Sarah could react, the spirits surged forward. The air grew thick, heavier, as if the very walls of the house were closing in. The strangers screamed as the spirits claimed them, their faces contorting in terror as they were pulled into the canvases. The portraits began to shift, their once still faces now animated with life, or rather, death. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, watching as the portraits came to life before her eyes. The faces of the strangers twisted into distorted, nightmarish versions of themselves, their screams now part of the eternal torment of the painted world. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. She had not escaped the spirits. She had become the very thing she feared. She was no longer an artist. She was a keeper of souls, a prisoner to the portraits, to the spirits, to the immortality she had sought and found. The final bargain had been struck, and Sarah was its cost. She had thought she could control the dead, but in the end, she had only become a part of them. Final payoff. Sarah's body was no longer hers. Her soul was gone, consumed by the very spirit she had once tried to capture. She had bargained for immortality, but the price was far worse than she could have ever imagined. The spirits, once trapped in her paintings, had taken everything: her identity, her love, her very humanity. Now she stood as their keeper, their vessel, forever bound to the portraits that had once been her masterpiece. The souls she had tried to free were now free to take anyone who dared to look too long at her work. The door she had opened could never be closed. Sarah was now part of the Arthur image, her essence, trapped forever on canvas. And those who gazed upon her paintings would find themselves pulled into the very darkness she had unwittingly unleashed. The price of immortality had been her soul, and now it was theirs.